Great. Okay, just whenever you're ready.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, dear colleagues and friends. Welcome to the session on trends in civic space and participation in enabling civil society, a session of the 2022 Global People's Assembly organized by the Global Call to Action Against Poverty. And it's part of the Global Week of Action Act for SDGs from the 16th to the 25th of September. Today, we are confronted by multiple crises and volatility, where aggressive forces are mobilizing a fierce backlash. Yet, dogged civil society and people's movements are still winning vital battles. During this session, we will discuss the most recent trends in civic spaces, including the lasting impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, which for a lot of us is still with us today, and in which in many countries has been weaponized to clamp down on civil society actors and critical individuals. Finally, we will try to understand why global discourse on the importance of civil society is at stark odds with realities at home. And we hope to suggest a possible approach of building trust towards meeting a common sustainable development agenda. So good afternoon once again. I'm Glenis Balange of the CSO Partnership for Development Effectiveness Global Secretariat, and I'm your moderator for today's session. I see that now we have a good number of participants from different parts of the world, and probably most of us have gone through or are going through disabling policies, state regulations, and even political repression. And we are in solidarity with you today and the years to come. So let me run you through the session's agenda. We have a 1-hour session, and the first presenter will be, they will be two. They are from CIVICUS. Julieta Zurbrich, Civic Space Research Advisor of CIVICUS, and Ines Pusadela, Senior Research Specialist of CIVICUS, will discuss on the CIVICUS Monitor and the State of Civil Society reports. Then this will be followed by a presentation of Charles Gay of the Global Programs Advisor on Governance of Christian Aid, who will discuss on civic space and COVID-19. Then we will have two presentations from the CPDE, the Civil Society Partnership for Development Effectiveness, on the results of the VNR study and the building trust towards an enabling environment, that will be presented by Josefina Villegas and Matthew Simmons. And then finally, we will have an open plenary for questions and reactions, and of course, insights from all of you participants today. So without further ado, I would like to call on our colleagues from CIVICUS, Julieta Zurbrich and Ines Pusadela. Julieta, you have the floor, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. I'm going to share my screen now so we can start presenting. Please let me know if you can see my screen. Okay, good. Great. So again, thank you for the invitation. The idea for me here is to present in a few minutes and very briefly the key trends of civic space that the CIVICUS Monitor has been able to see recently. With the CIVICUS Monitor, we aim to share reliable and up-to-date information on the state of civil society freedoms in all countries in the world. And basically, when we talk about civil society freedoms, the core 3 freedoms that we cover are those that we show there: the freedom of peaceful assembly, the freedom of association, and the freedom of expression. But we also take a look on how the states are doing in their duty to protect those freedoms. So the monitor is a global attempt to quantify and describe the current reality of civic space. And to do so, we analyze information about the civil society freedoms, and we rate all countries in the world in 5 different categories, those that you can see on the screen over there. From the most open civic spaces, where the state usually enables and safeguards the enjoyment of civic space for all people living in the country, where levels of fear are low and citizens are free to form association, to demonstrate, to more closed civic space, where the situation is totally the opposite, where the atmosphere is of fear and violence usually prevails, where the state and also non-state actors systematically imprison, injure, kill people with impunity when they try to exercise their civil rights. So in that context, we categorize all countries in the world. And in the next slide, we can see how is the situation today. So at the moment, as you can see, there is a very concerning situation. Not many green countries on the map, especially if we see Africa and Asia, the situation is very concerning. And in the next slide, we can see the same situation, but now in numbers. As we see here, only 39 countries in the world are rated as open, 41 are rated as narrow countries. And if we add up the countries with more restricted situations, we have that 117 countries in the world are obstruct, repressed, or closed. This is even more worsening and concerning if we see it in terms of population, as we see it here. Almost 90% of the world population lives in countries where the civil society freedoms are compromised. These, again, are the countries that we consider obstructed, repressed, or closed. And what is more, 25% of the world live in completely closed environments regarding to civic space. So here we can see how was the situation the past year. The past year we found evidence of deterioration of civic space in all regions in many countries. However, the CIVICUS Monitor is particularly concerned about the situation in Europe, where we found that Belarus, Belgium, Czech Republic, and Poland experienced a downgrade in their rating. So Europe is the region that generally has more open countries, but year after year, we continue to see signs of serious deterioration. So as you can see on the slide, the past year, 13 countries were downgraded, and only one registered an improvement in their ratings that was from obstructed to narrow. So we can also use the CIVICUS Monitor data to see which were the top violations to civic freedoms during 2021. You can see it there on the slide, but once again, the detention of protesters was the most common violation. In particular, in 2021, protesters were detained in over 90 countries in the world. And not only that, but the use of excessive force against protesters were also very widespread. We had documented this in over 70 countries in the world in 2021. So that's also a concerning for us. In second place, we find the intimidation of human rights defenders as a very, very common violation that was registered the past year. And then we can see the use or passage of restrictive law in the third place. In this case, the restrictive law as a violation has climbed to the third position after being at the end of the list in previous year. And this is a clear consequence of governments using the pandemic to introduce or implement additional restrictions on civic freedoms. But I'm not going to get into that because there is another session that talks about COVID-19 and the consequences. But yes, it's an important thing to consider. So yeah, just to finalize, another idea that I wanted to say is that even though, of course, in the CIVICUS Monitor, we can see that the more severe violations are usually documented in countries that are more repressed or closed, in general, violations to civic space are documented everywhere in countries with every type of rating. In fact, here we can see in this slide the detention of protesters and how is the distribution between ratings. And we can see that it's a very, very common violation in narrow countries, but also it's quite common in open civic spaces. So we have to keep an eye on all countries regardless of the ratings. And just to finalize, and before Ines take the lead on this, I wanted to transmit that even though the panorama, of course, is very concerning, not all is bad news. And despite the increase in restrictions, civil society has found ways to speak up and claim their rights. But I think Ines is going to talk about how they did that the past year. So yeah, that's from my side. Ines, you can go ahead whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much, Julieta. Will you please keep moving the presentation forward? Okay, thank you very much. So yes, as Julieta has just said, not everything is bad news. And actually our research, we have a second strand of research that's not about the context in which civil society does its work, but it's about civil society action. So we are tracking civil society action and especially civil society victories in claiming rights and trying to understand how those victories are achieved and what needs to be done to be more effective and more sustainable in a few areas of action, such as demands for socioeconomic justice, struggles for democracy, challenging exclusion and claiming the rights of women, LGBTQI+ people, migrants and refugees, and so on, climate action and action on the environment, and civil society action at a global level. So we have been tracking, starting this year, actually, at the beginning of 2022, we launched this new initiative, CIVICUS Lens, which tracks ongoing events, analyzes events as they happen instead of doing one report once a year. And then our report now only pulls out the trends. You know, we try to understand what it all means at the end of the year, what everything that happened that we analyzed means after all. So this is what I'm going to talk to you about, 5 major trends that we observed in the analysis of civil society action over the past year. Please, Julieta, you can move on. So first, the first key trend is protests about the rise of prices of essentials and fuel. This is something we've been tracking for a while, and we saw how this worsened. The situation was worsened by Russia's war on Ukraine, and people who were already under strain due to the pandemic reacted in protest. And one thing that we saw and that makes us think that the civic space situation is going to get worse is that we are seeing protests happen in places where there aren't usually many protests. In very authoritarian and repressive contexts where there are no other means of expressing dissent, people are going out to the streets to protest when the situation gets too bad for them. And we saw that happen in Sri Lanka, and we saw that happen in Kazakhstan, and we saw protests repressed very violently. So one thing that we can anticipate is that these kind of protests are going to keep happening. They are currently happening in Indonesia, for example, and that restrictions on the freedom of assembly are going to mount as well. Let's move to the second trend, which is about the state of democracy. And this is another trend that also feeds into the regression of civic space. We see how democracy is under attack in many different ways. including some ways that we thought at some point that were a thing of the past, such as military coups. We saw military coups happen in Burkina Faso, in Guinea, in Mali, in Sudan. So we realized that there are new authoritarian regimes now that they didn't exist a year or two before. We also see how democracy is being subverted from within by leaders that are elected and sometimes are very popular, and they are taking control of institutions, concentrating powers, rewriting constitutions, and imposing further restrictions on civil society. And we're seeing that in many places. So in Tunisia, we're seeing it in Salvador. We are also seeing the consolidation of authoritarian regimes, formerly democracies that were degraded to the point that are unrecognizable anymore. And we are seeing that, for example, in Nicaragua. We are seeing a degradation of democracy coming hand in hand with China's power, promoting a different political model and trying to impose this approach, for example, in Hong Kong. We realize that the tide of right-wing populism isn't over, and it's making advances in several European countries. The next one to watch is Italy. So we're seeing lots of polarization, political volatility, and fragmentation. We are also seeing some reasons for hope. We are seeing processes of democratic deepening in countries such as Chile. We've seen changes of government that were also encouraging in other countries such as Honduras. So we don't think that everything is lost, but definitely we are experiencing democratic regression. Third trend, I'm going to move a little bit faster, is about the ongoing anti-rights wave. We are seeing mobilized and very well-funded neoconservative groups denying rights to women, to LGBTQI people, even to migrants and refugees. So we are seeing anti-rights forces on the rise. At the same time, we are looking at civil society victories all over the place. And that's something I would like to highlight, because there's one big case of regression that seems to sort of occupy the whole picture, because it's so important, because it has global implications, that of the US. But honestly, there are a lot more countries that have made progress in claiming women's rights, sexual and reproductive rights, LGBTQI rights, than countries that have made regression. And that is because of civil society action. Another reason to hope is number 4, Julieta, please, is civil society action for climate justice. This is something that was a little bit on hold for a couple of years, because after the 2019 mass mobilizations for climate action, we all expected that 2020 would be the year of climate action. And it was the year of the pandemic instead. So we are still waiting, and not only waiting, but civil society is working to make it happen. We know we are running out of time. Civil society has been urging political leaders to listen to science for a while, and science tells us we don't have a lot of time. We and civil society who has mobilized in global spaces has been discouraged disappointed, I would say, by the outcomes of COP26, and are putting lots of expectation into COP27. Now here we have a restriction, which is a civic space restriction, and it is that COP27 is taking place in Egypt, which is a country with closed civic space. And we are afraid that without enough civil society pressure, well, nothing will happen. So civil society keeps mobilizing for climate change, and it has done it in many different ways. It diversified its tactics, in part due to the pandemic, for example, putting lots of effort in climate litigation and starting to get some victories, forcing companies and states to account. And number 5, civil society action at the global level. Well, one ongoing trend that we have verified yet again this year is how inadequate global governance institutions are. And that was clearly shown by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the inability of the UN Security Council to do anything about it. But we still have civil society trying to open up spaces at the global level in international institutions and promoting a reform of international institutions to make them more receptive to civil society input. That's something we are seeing today, and I mean today, 21st September, as the UN General Assembly is ongoing in New York. We are seeing yet again how civil society, which is key in making human rights institutions and international institutions generally work, how it is denied access to the key arenas where decisions are made. So that's another area where civil society keeps pushing. And yeah, that would be our 5 trends. I hope I didn't go on for too long. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julieta and Ines, for your very concise and meaningful reports. And indeed, there's a raging global economic crisis, and that's felt by people worldwide, not only, but more so in the global south, but also increasingly by the working peoples of the global north, so to speak. So, and you made good time. Thank you very much for that. And at this point, it was also mentioned earlier that COVID-19, the pandemic, is a very important factor in how we analyze the civic space globally. So at this point, I would like to call on Charles, who's the Global Programs Advisor on Governance of Christian Aid, to talk about civic space and COVID-19. You have the floor, Charles.
Thanks so much, Linus, and thank you for having me here. Let me just share the screen. I'll find a presentation. I hope you can see that. I'll make it a bit bigger. So yeah, I'm Charles Gay. I'm the Global Advisor on Governance and Rights with Christian Aid. Yeah, so I'm based in the UK, but we have programs all around the world, and the global COVID-19 pandemic, obviously, as we mentioned, brought unprecedented restrictions to civic space throughout 2020 and into 21, and we set out to research the impact of this phenomenon. Our mission as Christian Aid is to stand together with poor and marginalized people and civil society groups to express and negotiate their interests, values, and identities, and to claim rights and hold power holders accountable. So we asked in our study what have been the effects of COVID-19 pandemic on civic space, on accountability, and we looked at primary data in Bangladesh and Nigeria. We also looked at some case studies. So these were all really developed by the staff in country, weren't really dictated. They were given a lot of freedom to come up with questions and really to chart what people were reporting from our perspective, from our partners' perspective on the ground. We also wanted to look at what alternative ways of organizing they had experienced, and to come up with some recommendations, some practical ideas for how we protect and expand this space. I think our study makes very clear that many states used the pandemic, as has been mentioned already, to crack down on citizen participation for severe limits on freedom of speech and assembly, and a sharp increase in government surveillance, as many of us will have noticed. And civic organizations face an increasing challenge to the way of working as well. But some of these are long-term issues. Some of them have been around for a long time and are now being exacerbated, have been exacerbated by COVID-19, and still COVID-19 is around in many places. And many of the restrictions have lifted now, but we still see the effects. Even as that immediate need for emergency measures has receded, we see many remaining curbs on civic freedom and new proposals to restrict and monitor civil society. Even in the country I'm speaking to you right now, in the UK, there are measures going through Parliament to restrict civil society ability to assemble and protest. It's therefore urgent and important to identify future ways to protect and expand civil society and the space we operate in, making it more inclusive, excuse me, and support the communities on the ground and the organisations on the ground to do effective programming, policy, and advocacy work. So, just to give you some headlines, I guess on the paper, you can look at it for yourself. We've got a summary on our website with the long report. If you go to our policy blog, there's a link to it there. And I think I put it in the chat as well. The headline's really from Nigeria. Let's start with Nigeria, but where we had a very kind of hopeful signs in some ways in civic space and civil society gaining ground and being more involved in government decision making, being listened for and more. We saw a real setback in that. The civil society organisations we spoke to documented how they felt. The majority of them felt that they had gone backwards. I think it's something like 63% of the respondents we spoke to noted significant restrictions to freedom of assembly. They cited a surveillance culture, undue arrests. We can all remember the NSARS protests from earlier last year, and a weakening of civil society government relationships. Maybe that would have happened with or without the pandemic. It's difficult to have a test on that, but they felt that as COVID-19 restrictions came in, that was used as an excuse and perhaps as a reason. We saw, I think, some specific differences between urban and rural settings. So, for example, the urban settings, and we'll see this in Bangladesh report as well, the urban settings where people were able to access internet much more easily, and network was much more available for people. In rural settings, it's much harder and much less opportunity to afford the data that you would need to access. And we also saw funding shortages for civil society programs. I'm sure many organizations like Christian Aid as an NGO applies for funding from many different sources, and much of that dried up. Humanitarian assistance was provided, but civil society programs were cut. So looking at Bangladesh as an example as well, I think there's a long-term narrative about democratic decline in Bangladesh. A lot of institutional constraints. The media described constraints on their operations. COVID-19 brought a huge economic impact on the power of organizations to operate and organize. We saw a lot of discrimination against the specific groups we looked at, Dalit, Adivasi, and transgender groups. And there's the story of the well, which was, I think, an exclusion of a community, but was done under cover of shutting that community down. And we saw sackings and the removal of activists from prominent positions, all under the cover of COVID-19 restrictions, if you like. Briefly, just to run through, I've gone too far on that, but if I look at briefly at some of the civic spaces examples, we looked at the IOPT example. So in Israel, we saw much greater surveillance and with a huge reliance and imposition on the state part of digital surveillance and monitoring of people's movements under the cover of COVID-19, and that was challenged in the courts. Things have changed politically since we studied their situation in Colombia, but we saw private sector interests being used by the government, almost against civil society. I think if we looked at Zimbabwe as an example as well in Southern Africa, where we saw a lot of crackdown on women activists, on people being able to protest physically and being prevented from assembling and getting together. But that was also a crackdown on the media and the reliance on actual independent media sources to get voice out and heard. And we also looked at Myanmar, and Myanmar is an interesting case because of the military junta and the alternative government. So many things would have happened without, but we saw a sidelining of aid from civil society groups. We saw a crackdown on participation and COVID-19 restrictions being used as a way of pushing that through. So we can see that there's many different challenges have been thrown up by COVID-19. We can see the responses in terms of alternative organizing. We feel that there's only so much you can do when the operational rules are great, when governments are hostile to civic space, and we see this even today increasingly in some countries where NGOs are having offices raided and pressures being brought on them to in terms of registration, and Christian Aid had to move out of certain countries recently. Moving to online civic space is a partial solution, but it is exclusionary as well. And there is something about people being able to get together and physically gather that is lost through things like COVID-19 restrictions, as well as digital exclusion. So we are very happy to share this these results and this research. We're very keen to push 2 or 3 big recommendations from our report, which is about how we need to have sort of supranational alliances to support people who are being particularly undermined by national restrictions. We want to deploy legal challenges and protect press freedom where we can. And we're keen to move ahead, as will be happening in other sessions, on the SDG 16 pressures. We think the OECD DAC recommendations are very good and very welcome, and we should be putting some funding behind these, as many countries have committed themselves to do. And we are very hopeful that we can have an alliance across civil society internationally to push for these things. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Charles, for presenting quite nuanced and disaggregated data and insight on the shrinking civic space, not only in countries, but also among the more marginalized sectors of the population. And it's a bit the same, the findings from the Christian Aid study to the findings of an earlier study by CPDE, which found that during the pandemic, CSOs were really not treated as independent development actors. And a lot of the space have been constricted where CSOs perform their functions and mandates. So we have, I think, Charles can post the link to the Christian Aid study in the chat box so that you can access the full study later. So yeah, there's a question from the chat box. There's no French interpretation. I'm so sorry, Mr. Malik. See, there's no French interpretation, no interpretation at all for this session. So moving on, I would like to call on 2 members of the CPDE Global Secretariat in succession who will be presenting in succession. Josefina Villegas of the Membership and Policy Coordinator of CPDE will present the results of the VNR study of CPDE this year, because we have it every year. And Matt Simmons, the Senior Policy and Liaison Officer of CPDE, will present the Trust Initiative, or Building Trust Towards an Enabling Environment for Civil Society Organizations. So take it away, Joe and Matt.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, colleagues, for joining this session. I know that an hour-long session is not a lot of time to present all of the different issues that we're discussing, so I'll try to be brief. CPD works on an annual report study that tries to, sorry, I'm looking at my own face and that's kind of disturbing. Okay. So CPD works every year on a study that tries to focus on and pick up information, data from CSO perspectives on how the VNR processes are being conducted at country level. And this allows us to draw some conclusions on how the processes are being actually participatory, inclusive, basically from the effectiveness development principles. So I'll just move on to the presentation. We have it here. This year for 2022, this is the 6th edition for the study. This year's study was entitled Challenge the Ways of the Old, CSO Demands for Urgent and Extraordinary Actions in Effective Development Cooperation Towards Pandemic Recovery. Because of course, we were picking up also from, let's say, the post-pandemic context and the recovery, and what efforts are actually governments doing in that regard, and how this is being reflected in the VNR reporting process. So just very briefly on the methodology, because it's also important to highlight that we work on this study basically with our members. So it's never a really exhaustive baseline, let's say, but it's quite comprehensive. We had 26 countries represented, out of which 18 were countries presenting their VNR report in the latest high-level policy forum edition. Out of these 26 countries, we had 47 civil society organizations participating. 2/3 of these organizations have participated in previous editions, and 1/3 are new organizations involved with the study for the first time. And we bring this in because we think this also highlights the commitment of civil society organizations in contributing to these initiatives to evidence perspectives from the ground. This is just the very big picture of the different countries that were represented and the number of CSO respondents from each country. All of these can be found in the study, which I would share the link for in a bit. And basically what we find is that SDG processes are still very government-centered, and that there is a widespread lack of consultation mechanisms for other stakeholders. Efforts to build back better are unchanged or simply go back to the ways of old, including, of course, human rights and people rights being curtailed and development being exclusive rather than inclusive. So we are making evidence that there is a lack of meaningful engagement, as mentioned. Although this percentage is a little bit weird, but let's say 87% out of the 47 respondents responded that their countries have integrated the SDGs into their national frameworks, meaning there is appropriation of the Sustainable Development Agenda. Only 7 CSOs were able to report that their recommendations were included in the country's VNR reporting. And only 6 CSOs were able to access their country's national framework. So there is also a lack of transparency on the information that's available for civil society organizations to keep their role both as dog watch, but also as in order to plan our own actions and interventions on the ground and produce better synergies with other initiatives happening at national and local level. So, yeah, so I hope I'm okay on time. Just let me know if I'm derailing too much. But as mentioned, we structure our survey around the 4 effective development cooperation principles, which are country ownership, inclusive partnerships, transparency and accountability, and a focus on results. And we added a specific section on whether countries are reporting on the impacts of the COVID crisis or not. So main finding is that progress on all principles either remains stagnant or has declined. Focusing on country ownership, it basically remains the same. As mentioned, localization of the SDGs is still unrealized. There is I think I already mentioned this, so I won't take too long, but none of the respondents were satisfied on how their countries were implementing their SDG strategies. Following up on country ownership, there is a continued lack of mechanism for participation of stakeholders, as mentioned, and corruption, lack of good governance, and the infringement of human rights keeps CSOs from engaging in the national SDG processes. When we move on to inclusive partnerships, only 6 out of 10 CSOs report that there are existing mechanisms for CSOs to engage in their country's SDG planning, implementation, and review processes. Where these mechanisms are existent, the quality of consultation and engagement spaces varies significantly depending on each country. Of course, this is in line with everything presented by colleagues from Civicus at the beginning of the session. Main barriers to participation are the lack of resources and funding, the nature and structure of how consultations are conducted, slow and bureaucratic procedures, and lack of information regarding SDG implementation. CSOs included in government SDG consultations are mostly included in the planning stage. We see a declining tendency from the planning to the implementation to the evaluation. So CSOs engagement and quality of engagement is derailed as the process advances. And only 7 out of 47 CSOs said their inputs were integrated into the final document, which we think is really significant. And I'll move on to the following on transparency and accountability. 60% report having existing national frameworks and reporting processes, but only a fraction can access this information, as mentioned before. So there is also a lack of accessibility to information. Now, when we focus on results, and this is a very big chart, just to read it, each impact is measured to 100%. So some of the positive outcomes that we were able to identify through this survey was that there is greater awareness of the SDGs at the local level compared to previous editions, previous years, and that there had been, at least there are reported increased efforts to promote gender equality in national development programs, as well as gender equality budget allocations. Yet, the major gap is still the degree to which CSOs are consulted and engaged in the national SDG implementations. And some other gaps are the ones mentioned here, right? There is a low awareness, there's government budget allocations that are not aligned with SDG priorities, low awareness regarding SDGs among implementers at the national level. At the local level, the same situation happening. CSOs not being sufficiently consulted, and other relevant stakeholders not sufficiently consulted, especially minority groups. And lastly, in terms of the COVID-19 crisis, most CSOs have not been treated as development actors in their own right in this response, not even to mention the fact that shrinking space has increased, and there is an increase in that trend. Past findings of CPD show that only CSOs who are either more institutionalized or government friendly are the ones invited or allowed to participate in government decision-making processes. And many countries only partially depict the repercussions of the pandemic and what are the actual measures to mitigate it, to mitigate these trends. So I see that I should be wrapping up already. I think that this is our last slide, and these are our main recommendations from the study to governments. We are trying, oh, okay, that didn't come out right in the numbering. We're trying to move this document and do advocacy around these issues to improve VNR reporting processes and ideally have a more concrete positive impact on civic space. So I'll just leave the link to the study in the chat box. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. And Matt can proceed if you're ready.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for these presentations. I think in the interest of time, I won't even share any slides. I'll just try to run through really quickly some of the sort of reflections that we've been having as a platform in CPD based on these experiences that I think CSOs and the sort of the organizations that we work with are having, and I think all share. I think it's pretty common. Everything that's been presented so far is something that we're as a global CSO community very well aware of. So what we're trying to do is think about maybe a different approach. Of course, they say this with the caveat from the outset that not every country context will allow for this kind of approach. I think the CIVICUS Monitor is quite good in how it kind of has a spectrum of what space looks like, and all the way from completely obstructed to sort of narrowed and so on. So I think when we think about what I present here, that it does not apply in every context, but that's sort of the point also, is that every context needs to have its own as its own approach. So basically, we're starting from sort of a fundamental recognition that CSOs are development actors. The ACRA Agenda for Action, which was a process related to the effectiveness agenda, recognized CSOs as development actors in their own right. We know that achieving the SDGs will not be possible without the support of civil society. I think that recognition is there. Even if we're only looking at sort of this from a development finance lens, CSO programs and the amount of money that's associated to them are critical to the SDGs. So you need to have civil society on board just at that basic level. And the SDGs themselves are emphasizing the need for partnerships and shifts in how governments engage with different actors in development, not only civil society, but there's that recognition there that it's not the sort of original government only. We're now looking at these whole of society approaches that's often referred to in sort of government arenas. At the same time, for CSOs to operate and to be effective development actors, there's strict requirements when it comes to civic space and the enabling environment. And this is obviously talking about the fundamental freedoms, the ability of CSOs to actually operate and do what they do and sort of connecting with communities. So the laws protecting the fundamental freedoms are the foundation of enabling environment, and they do exist in most places, but are often disregarded. And so in that sense, CSOs are hampered in their ability to fulfill their core mandate, and then ultimately not able to contribute to the realization of the SDGs. Now we take this in the context of global commitments, and several global commitments or agreements that recognize the importance of civil society. I mean, the SDGs themselves recognize the importance of civil society. We have the effectiveness agenda that recognizes the importance of civil society and the need for enabling environment. And some of the very same governments that are parties to these agreements don't actually respect those at the country level. So while there's this recognition of the importance of creating an enabling environment at the global level through a number of global commitments, the story differs drastically when we get to the country level, and try to understand what the reason is for that. Despite the intentions of the SDGs, it's not a framework that itself delivers the alterations at the national level that would naturally foster collaboration and partnership, especially in situations where these different development actors have been historically sort of skeptical of one another. So what we're thinking is a concerted action at country level to build trust and towards the achieving the SDGs, let's say, and sustainable development more broadly. We say this because the disenabling environment is unique to each country, I think we've heard, and it requires sort of strategic political action at the national level to thaw out these cold relationships, perhaps, and also sort of fast-tracked implementation on the promotion of the CSO enabling environment. There needs to be a more deliberate approach beyond the global level that's looking specifically at the policy and legal political space for the operation of civil society organizations at the national level. And then it needs to bring together all the different actors, from governments to providers, development partners, we say, the partner country governments, or CSO organizations, private sector parliamentarians, all these countries, in order to sort of cultivate an environment of trust towards a common objective of the SDGs. So it's really a question for us, is can deliberate efforts focused on building trust and overcoming the skepticism be made to support enabling environment for CSOs? Can exercises focused on trust building between these different actors facilitate better collaboration and partnership? And what are the minimum conditions that are needed to pursue these approaches? We don't actually have the answers. This is a new approach and a new angle that we're trying to look at the issue of enabling environment from, and we're trying to organize workshops or dialogues at the country level to the global level and see what comes of it. But it's something that we're kind of really thinking about as a possible way to to respond to the shrinking and closing civic space, the lack of progress on SDGs, and the disenabling environment for civil society. So it's something I think that we just want to put forward to the People's Assembly to think about, as if there's possible solutions here that we can find through the idea of trust building. Thanks, Glenn.
Thank you very much, Matt, for introducing us to trust initiative, trust building initiative, and also for posing those difficult questions. So at this point, we have heard a lot of inputs, so we can have around 8 minutes of questions and very, very brief comments. So who wants to ask the first question to our speakers? Can I have you can raise your hand, or you can open your microphone if you want to speak. So who would like to get the ball rolling for the first question? I don't see any raised hands, but I think you have a lot of questions. Okay, Claudio first, and then Mariam. So please, Claudio, please ask your question very briefly.
Thank you very much. It's not really a question, it's more a comment to what Matt said, is that the implementation of the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs needs the participation of civil society. I would like to actually say that there would be no implementation of the 2030 Agenda and the SDG without the participation of civil society. Organized civil society has been the protagonist on the implementation of this agenda. Most governments and private sectors have been fighting against the agenda, even though they greenwash, rainbow wash, blue wash, but they are acting against the agenda. And we are the watchdogs. We are the implementers. We build the communities, as Matt put it very well. So we just need to get access to more resources so we can be more transformative and leverage our actions to a wider audience, into a wider territory. That's my comment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Claudio. And then for now, I'll take the comment of Mariam, and then I'll let the speakers respond. So Mariam, please.
Yes, thank you very much. Sorry, I keep my video shut down. But I wrote this little commentary in the message in the chat, which I'll repeat it here. As I am a researcher in the civil society space, especially in the cultural sector and regarding cultural policy for sustainable development. And this idea that the civil society should be given all this space, and that there should be trust built with between civil society and governments. This is repeated every year in every kind of national or international gatherings, but it rarely happens. I mean, how many more years can we just come back and talk about trust building when we know that there are many governments which are shutting down the civic space deliberately, which are limiting, restricting the civic space deliberately? So then this, I mean, how can we get out of this rhetorical advocacy for building trust between governments and civil society? Is there a way for civil society to act somewhat independently? I mean, I don't mean in opposition to governments necessarily, but independently at an international level, where in one country the resources, national resources or governmental resources are being restricted or unavailable simply. How can international civil society act to inform one another in different national contexts? I think that is, for me, the main dilemma that should be really addressed. And so, I mean, all these presentations have been very interesting, and I thank all of the speakers for them. But I think when we talk about civil society, especially now, so the SDG is really the talk of every forum. I think really we should be able to speak about civil society in more enabling ways at the civil society level, internationally and locally, but basically at all levels of governance, from local to international. So that's the comment I wanted to make. Thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you, Mariam, for your comment. And if Matt has a very brief answer to that, that would be appreciated.
I don't have an answer to that. I think that we're putting the question forward because basically, Miriam, what we're finding is indeed that the commitments at the global level are not translating to the reality of an improved enabling environment for civil society. So we're sort of, I mean, not throwing things at the wall to see what sticks, but really trying to understand what are some possible approaches to reversing this trend. Because until now, despite what we're seeing, what kind of commitments governments are making and different actors are making at the global level, it's a completely different reality at the national level. And even this with the SDGs, trying to give us the framework to do this, it doesn't sort of necessitate it in and of themselves. It still requires the action and sort of policy at the national level. But it's only one sort of element that we're kind of thinking about. I'm sure if we had more time, the colleagues from Civicus and Christian Aid and everyone else on here would be able to provide some other ideas as well.
And Ingo also answered on the chat that this is precisely what the Global People's Assembly is for, to create the space for exchange and cooperation. So other speakers would like to briefly comment on it. Thank you. Okay, I'm looking at the time, and if no other speaker would like to give an input on the trust between multi-stakeholders, and there are no more hands raised, then I think it's safe to say that it has been a very productive 1-hour session. And I would like to end this session of a very important quote that's being lived with by a lot of activists globally, that they tried to bury us and they didn't know we were seeds. So as seedlings and sprouts or saplings, we civil society members, grassroots organizations, people's movements, and other organizations will collaborate and work together to fight repression and demand justice, not only for civil and political rights, but also for social, economic, and cultural rights. And as we collectively say, we forge on despite these challenges, and we will win. So thank you very much to all the speakers. Thank you very much, GCAP, for organizing this. And I wish you all a very good afternoon, evening, morning, wherever you are. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, everyone.